The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of yet another strange house as 16-year-old Maya Johnson dragged her worn duffel bag up unfamiliar stairs. 10 homes in 8 years. She'd gotten used to this dance, this rhythm of temporary belonging. The steps creaked under her feet, each sound a reminder that this too would probably be just another stop along the way. Her new foster mother, Mrs. Bennett, walked ahead, chattering warmly about the neighborhood, the local park just 2 blocks away, and the corner store that made the best sandwiches in Philadelphia. Maya nodded politely, but her mind was already counting days, preparing for the inevitable moment when something would go wrong. It always did. "And this is your room," Mrs. Bennett said, pushing open a door to reveal walls painted in soft yellow. A real desk sat by the window, not one of those wobbly card tables she'd gotten used to. There was even a bookshelf, empty but promising. Maya's fingers itched to fill it with the few precious books she carried in her bag, but she held back. Unpacking meant hoping, and hope was a luxury she'd learned to live without. "The bed's new," Mrs. Bennett continued, her voice carrying a gentleness that made Maya's chest tight. "I remember you mentioned in your file that you like to read, so I thought you might want a reading lamp." She gestured to a simple lamp on the bedside table, its shade decorated with subtle silver stars. Maya ran her fingers along the lamp's smooth surface, fighting the warmth that threatened to crack her careful composure. No one had ever read her file that carefully before. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, after Mrs. Bennett had shown her around the rest of the house, a cozy living room with well-worn couches, a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and a small backyard with a garden full of tomato plants, Maya sat cross-legged on her new bed. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of Mrs. Bennett humming in the kitchen downstairs. She pulled out her most treasured possession, a battered notebook filled with poems she'd written over the years. Each page held pieces of herself she'd never dared to share. Stories of midnight moves between homes, of watching other kids get chosen while she remained behind, of dreams she buried so deep they almost disappeared. A soft knock at her door made her quickly slide the notebook under her pillow. "Maya, I made some hot chocolate, if you'd like some," Mrs. Bennett called through the door. For a moment, Maya hesitated. She'd learned the hard way that accepting kindness often led to disappointment. But something in Mrs. Bennett's voice, something in the way she'd noticed the little details about Maya, made her want to try. "Okay," she answered, surprising herself. When she opened the door, Mrs. Bennett stood there holding 2 mugs topped with tiny marshmallows, her smile as warm as the drink she carried. "I don't know if you like marshmallows," she said, offering Maya a mug, "but I always think they make everything a little more special." That night, sitting on her new bed, sipping hot chocolate with a woman who'd fought to read her file, who'd painted her room yellow because it was cheerful, who'd bought her a reading lamp just because she liked books, Maya felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The dangerous, wonderful spark of possibility. She still didn't unpack her bag. She wasn't ready for that leap of faith just yet. But as she lay down to sleep, the soft glow of her new lamp casting star-shaped shadows on the wall, Maya wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time might be different. Maya's first day at her new school felt like walking through a maze blindfolded. Benjamin Franklin High School was bigger than any school she'd attended before, its hallways stretching endlessly in every direction. She clutched her schedule tight, trying to make sense of room numbers that seemed to follow no logical pattern. The morning passed in a blur of new faces and voices. Maya had perfected the art of being invisible, answering when called upon but never volunteering more, sitting close enough to seem engaged but far enough to avoid conversation. It was easier this way. No attachments meant no goodbyes. But during lunch period, as she searched for a quiet corner in the bustling cafeteria, someone interrupted her carefully planned solitude. "Hey, you're in my chemistry class, right?" A tall boy with kind eyes and a bright smile stood before her, holding his lunch tray. "I'm David. Mind if I join you?" Before Maya could think of a polite way to say no, He'd already settled into the seat across from her. She noticed his worn basketball shoes and the small paint stains on his fingers. An athlete who did art, maybe. The thought intrigued her despite herself. "You don't talk much, do you?" David asked, but his tone wasn't mocking. If anything, he seemed genuinely curious. "That's cool. Sometimes the quiet ones have the most interesting things to say when they do speak up." Maya found herself studying him over her sandwich. "I'm Maya," she offered finally, surprising herself. "And yes, I was in your chemistry class. Third row." "I knew it. You were the one who actually understood what Mr. Chen was talking about with molecular structures." I was completely lost. His laugh was warm and genuine, making the corners of Maya's mouth twitch upward despite her best efforts to maintain her usual guard. After school, Maya walked slowly home, her mind replaying the unexpected lunch conversation. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed Mrs. Bennet waiting on the front porch, a small watering can in hand. "How was your first day?" Mrs. Bennet asked, tending to a row of bright marigolds that lined the steps. Maya paused, considering her words carefully. "Different," she said finally. "Someone actually talked to me at lunch." Mrs. Bennet's face lit up, but she carefully controlled her excitement, something Maya appreciated. "Oh, would you like to tell me about it while we water these flowers? They're thirsty little things." Before she knew it, Maya found herself holding a spare watering can, sharing bits and pieces of her day as they moved from plant to plant. She told Mrs. Bennet about David's paint-stained fingers, about the way he'd made chemistry class sound like an adventure rather than a dreaded subject. "You know," Mrs. Bennet said thoughtfully, adjusting a drooping marigold, "these flowers remind me of you, Maya." Maya looked up, puzzled. "How so?" "Well, they're stronger than they look. Put them in the right soil, give them a little care, and they'll bloom beautifully. But they need time and patience." Mrs. Bennet's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. That evening, as Maya sat at her desk working on chemistry homework, she caught herself smiling at a text from David about their impossible homework assignment. Outside her window, the marigolds swayed gently in the evening breeze, their orange and yellow petals catching the last rays of sunlight. For the first time in years, Maya pulled her duffel bag out from under her bed. She didn't unpack everything. She wasn't quite ready for that. But she did take out her books, carefully arranging them on the shelf by her desk. Each spine held memories of different homes, different disappointments. But maybe, just maybe, these books could start collecting new memories here. As she placed the last book on the shelf, she heard Mrs. Bennet calling her down for dinner, the smell of homemade lasagna wafting up the stairs. Maya looked at her partially unpacked bag, then at the row of books standing proud on their new shelf. Sometimes, she thought, the scariest part of hope is letting yourself believe in it. The first time Maya held the old camera, her hands trembled slightly. It was a well-loved Nikon that Ms. Rodriguez, the art teacher, had pulled from a dusty cabinet in the back of the classroom. Sometimes, Ms. Rodriguez had said, her eyes twinkling, "We need to see the world differently to understand our place in it." Maya had only signed up for the art elective because it fit her schedule, expecting another class to fade into the background of her days. But something changed when she peered through that viewfinder for the first time. The world transformed into carefully framed moments, each one telling its own story. She started small, capturing the morning light streaming through classroom windows, the shadow patterns of leaves on the school courtyard, the way David's hands moved when he talked about basketball during lunch. Through the lens, everything felt safer, more controlled. She could observe life without having to be part of it. But Ms. Rodriguez had other ideas. "Your technical skills are growing," she said one afternoon, looking through Maya's latest photos. "But I want you to try something different. This weekend, I want you to photograph something that matters to you." Maya spent Saturday morning wandering around her neighborhood, camera in hand, trying to figure out what that meant. What mattered to someone who had learned not to let anything matter too much? She ended up in the backyard, where Mrs. Bennet was tending to her garden. Through the viewfinder, Maya watched as Mrs. Bennet gently tied up a struggling tomato plant, humming softly to herself. Click. The way the sun caught the silver in her hair. Click. The careful patience in her hands as she pruned dead leaves. Click. The small smile that appeared when she discovered a tiny green tomato hiding beneath the leaves. "What are you doing out here with that camera?" Mrs. Bennet asked, finally noticing Maya's presence. Maya lowered the camera slowly. "My art teacher asked us to photograph something that matters," she explained, then hesitated. "I hope you don't mind." Mrs. Bennet's face softened. "Mind? Oh, honey, I'm honored, though I must look a mess in my gardening clothes." "No," Maya said quietly, showing Mrs. Bennet a photo of her hands working with the tomato plant. "You look like someone who knows how to help things grow." That evening, as Maya downloaded her photos onto the school laptop Mrs. Bennet had helped her borrow, she found herself drawn to more than just the garden shots. She had unconsciously captured other moments too. The morning light on the kitchen table where they ate breakfast, the collection of mismatched coffee mugs in the cabinet, the way the porch steps had started to feel familiar under her feet. When Sunday came around, Maya discovered a new subject. Mrs. Bennet always cooked a big Sunday dinner, and today was no different. The kitchen filled with the smell of roasting chicken and sweet potatoes. Through her lens, Maya captured the steam rising from pots, the contrast of bright vegetables against the cutting board, the way Mrs. Bennet's hands moved with certainty as she kneaded dough for rolls. "Would you like to learn?" Mrs. Bennet asked, catching Maya watching through the camera. Before she knew it, Maya had set the camera aside and was elbow-deep in flour, learning how to feel when the dough was just right. Later, reviewing her photos for class, Maya found one that made her pause. It was a simple shot, her own hands next to Mrs. Bennet's, both dusted with flour, caught in the act of creating something together. In the background, slightly out of focus, sat the camera on the counter, forgotten in the moment. When she showed her weekend photos to Ms. Rodriguez on Monday, her teacher grew quiet, studying each image carefully. Finally, she looked up at Maya with gentle understanding in her eyes. "You see," she said softly, "sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we don't even know we're telling." That night, Maya added another item to her shelf beside her books, a printed copy of the hands and flower photo. It wasn't perfect. The lighting could have been better, the focus sharper, but it was real. And for the first time, Maya had captured a moment she wanted to remember, not just observe. The grocery store fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Maya pushed the cart down aisle 3, checking Mrs. Bennet's neat handwriting on the shopping list. After 2 months of Sunday dinners and morning coffee, she'd volunteered to do the weekly shopping. It felt good to contribute, to know someone trusted her with such a simple but important task. She was reaching for a can of diced tomatoes when she heard it. A laugh that stopped time. A laugh that belonged to bedtime stories from years ago, to broken promises and packed bags in the middle of the night. Maya's hand froze midair as her mother's voice floated over from the next aisle. "No, baby, put that back. We can't afford that today." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't heard that voice in 3 years, but it still had the power to make her feel 6 years old again, waiting by the window for a mother who never came home. The shopping list crumpled in her tight grip. She should walk away. She knew she should walk away, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her to the end of the aisle. And there she was, her mother, looking both exactly the same and completely different. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray she never would have allowed before. She was holding the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4. Maya's grocery cart squeaked, and her mother looked up. Their eyes met across the display of breakfast cereals, and Maya watched as recognition dawned on her mother's face, followed by something that looked like fear. "Maya." Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. The little boy tugged at her hand, asking for cookies, but she didn't seem to notice. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. The cart handle was slick under Maya's sweaty palms. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the background like she'd learned to do so well. But her voice, when it came, was steady. "Hello, Mother." Her mother took a step forward, then stopped, uncertainty written across her face. "You've grown so much. You look like someone you don't know." Maya finished for her, because it was true. This woman didn't know her, didn't know about her poetry, her photography, her quiet mornings with Mrs. Bennet in the garden. Didn't know how many nights she'd cried herself to sleep in strange beds, or how long it had taken her to trust anyone again. The little boy pulled harder on their mother's hand. "Mommy, who's that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Maya watched her mother struggle, watched her mouth open and close without sound. And in that moment of silence, Maya felt something shift inside her. Not healing, exactly, but understanding. "Nobody, sweetie," Maya said softly to the little boy, saving her mother from having to answer. "Just someone who used to know your mommy a long time ago." She turned her cart around, leaving her mother standing there with her new life, her new child, her old mistakes. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone and called Mrs. Bennet. "Can you come get me?" she asked, her voice finally cracking. "Please." Mrs. Bennet didn't ask questions, just said she'd be there in 10 minutes. Maya waited outside, the half-filled shopping cart abandoned inside, watching cars pass on the street. Each one could have been her mother leaving again, but this time, Maya was the one choosing to walk away. When Mrs. Bennet's old blue sedan pulled up, Maya got in without a word. They drove in silence until Maya found her voice again. "I saw my mother," she said finally. "She has another kid now. A little boy." Mrs. Bennet pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. "Do you want to talk about it?" Maya looked at the house, their house, with its crooked mailbox and marigolds by the steps. "Not yet," she said. "But can we make those cinnamon rolls you taught me about? The ones that take all afternoon?" Mrs. Bennet reached over and squeezed her hand. "Of course we can, sweetheart. We can take all the time you need." 3 days after the grocery store incident, Maya sat in the school cafeteria, pushing her lunch around her plate when David slid into his usual seat. Something was different today. His usual bright smile was missing, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and worry lines around his mouth. "Everything okay?" Maya asked, surprising herself by speaking first. A few months ago, she wouldn't have dared to ask, wouldn't have wanted to know. David stared at his untouched lunch. "My mom's in the hospital," he said quietly. "They found something during her regular checkup. They're not sure what it is yet," but his voice trailed off, and Maya watched his hands clench into fists on the table. The old Maya would have mumbled, "I'm sorry," and retreated into silence. The old Maya would have seen this as proof that caring about people only led to pain. But she wasn't that Maya anymore. "Do you want to skip next period?" she asked. "We could go to the art room. Ms. Rodriguez won't mind." In the quiet of the art room, surrounded by half-finished paintings and the smell of clay, David finally broke down. Maya sat beside him, remembering all the times she'd cried alone, all the times she needed someone to simply be there. "I don't know how to handle this," he admitted, wiping his eyes. "I'm supposed to be strong for my little sisters, but I'm terrified." Maya reached for her camera. It had become a comfort object of sorts, always in her bag. "Can I show you something?" She pulled up the photo of her hands next to Mrs. Bennet's, covered in flour. "I took this the day I started letting myself believe that caring about people might be worth the risk." David looked at the photo, then at her. "I didn't know you could take pictures like this." "I didn't either, until I stopped being afraid of what I might capture." Maya took a deep breath. "When I was 7, my mom left, just walked out one day and never came back. I saw her last week at the grocery store. She has a new family now. And you know what? It still hurts, but I'm not letting that stop me anymore." She turned to face him fully. "You don't have to be strong all the time, David. Sometimes being strong means letting other people help you." That afternoon, Maya asked Mrs. Bennet if David could join them for dinner. As they sat around the table, she watched through her camera's viewfinder as Mrs. Bennet drew David out of his shell, got him talking about his sisters, his mom, his fears. Click. The way his shoulders relaxed as he helped clear the dishes. Click. The moment he actually laughed at Mrs. Bennet's terrible pun about vegetables. Later, as they walked David home, Mrs. Bennet hung back, giving them space to talk. "Thank you," David said softly. "For today, for everything. I was afraid to tell anyone at school. Didn't want them looking at me differently." Maya thought about all the times she'd pushed people away for the same reason. "Sometimes," she said, choosing her words carefully, "the scary things are less scary when you share them." That night, as Maya loaded the day's photos onto her laptop, she found herself looking at her growing collection. There were the garden photos, the Sunday dinner series, and now these new ones of David. Not just the boy who made her laugh at lunch, but someone who trusted her enough to be vulnerable. Mrs. Bennet knocked softly on her door. "I brought you some hot chocolate, with extra marshmallows. I think we both need it today." Maya took the mug, letting its warmth seep into her hands. "I asked him to come back for Sunday dinner," she admitted. "I hope that's okay." Mrs. Bennet smiled, the kind of smile that made her whole face light up. "Of course it is. You know, Maya, watching you today, you've come so far from the girl who wouldn't unpack her bag." Maya glanced at her closet, where the duffel bag now sat empty, her clothes hanging neatly in their proper place. "Yeah," she said softly. "I guess sometimes you have to risk breaking your own heart to help someone else put theirs back together." The school hallway buzzed with excitement as students and parents filtered into the winter art showcase. Maya stood in front of her photography display, fidgeting with the edge of her new blue sweater, a gift from Mrs. Bennet for the special occasion. Her photos lined the wall in a careful arrangement, each one telling a piece of her story. "Stop fussing with your sweater," Mrs. Bennet whispered, appearing beside her with 2 cups of punch. "Your work is beautiful." Maya looked at her collection, trying to see it through others' eyes. There was the series of garden photos, showing Mrs. Bennet's hands nurturing plants through the seasons. The Sunday dinner collection captured stolen moments of laughter and warmth around their kitchen table, and in the center, larger than the rest, hung the flower-covered hands photo that had started it all. "What if nobody gets it?" Maya whispered back, accepting the punch, but too nervous to drink it. Before Mrs. Bennet could answer, David appeared with his family, his mom in a wheelchair, looking tired but proud, his 2 little sisters bouncing around excitedly. "Maya, these are amazing." His youngest sister pressed her nose against the glass covering a photo of morning light streaming through kitchen windows. More people gathered around her display. Maya overheard snippets of their conversations. "The composition is extraordinary. Look at the way she captures light. These feel so real." Ms. Rodriguez made her way through the crowd, stopping to study each photo carefully. "You've done something remarkable here, Maya," she said finally. "You've shown us what love looks like in everyday moments." A man in a suit introduced himself as the local newspaper's art critic. He asked Maya about her inspiration, her technique, her vision. The words came easier than she expected, flowing from some deep place inside her that had been waiting to speak. "I spent most of my life trying not to leave traces," she found herself saying. "These photos are about learning to leave marks on purpose, about choosing to be seen." As the evening wore on, Maya noticed a small crowd gathering around one particular photo she'd almost decided not to include. It showed the empty duffel bag that had once held all her belongings, now lying open and abandoned on her bedroom floor, while in the background, her clothes hung neatly in the closet, her books lined the shelves, and her camera sat on the desk. All the signs of a life being lived, not just survived. "That's my favorite," David said softly, appearing at her side. His mom had gone home to rest, but he'd stayed to help clean up. "It's like saying goodbye to something, but in a good way." Maya felt Mrs. Bennet's hand slip into hers and squeeze gently. "You know, Mrs. Bennet said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something. How would you feel about making this arrangement more permanent?" Maya's heart stopped, then started again. "You mean?" "I mean adoption, sweetie. If you want that. If you're ready." The word hung in the air like a photograph waiting to be taken, a moment on the edge of becoming permanent. Maya looked at her wall of photos, all the evidence of love she'd collected over the past months, all the proof that something beautiful could grow from broken pieces. "I think," Maya said slowly, "I've been ready for a while now. I just needed to be sure you were real." Mrs. Bennet pulled her into a tight hug, and Maya felt tears splash onto her new blue sweater. Behind them, David quietly picked up his camera. He'd started borrowing one from Ms. Rodriguez too, and captured the moment. Later that night, Maya added a new photo to her bedroom wall. Her and Mrs. Bennet embracing at the showcase, both crying and smiling at the same time. It wasn't perfectly focused, and the lighting wasn't ideal, but it was real. It was the moment she finally allowed herself to believe in permanent things. The adoption paperwork sat on the kitchen table like a promise waiting to be kept. Maya traced her fingers over the official letterhead, hardly daring to believe this was real. Just as Mrs. Bennet was about to sign the first page, the doorbell rang. Maya's social worker stood on the porch, her face tight with concern. "We need to talk," she said, clutching a folder to her chest. "Your biological mother has filed for reunification." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She felt Mrs. Bennet's steady hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to the present moment as the social worker explained the situation. Her mother claimed she'd turned her life around, that she was stable now, that she wanted another chance. "She can't do this," Maya whispered, but her voice grew stronger with each word. "She gave up that right 3 years ago. She has her new family, her new life. She can't just walk back into mine whenever she feels like it." The social worker spread papers across their kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared countless meals, where Maya had done her homework, where Mrs. Bennet had taught her how to knead bread. "She has the right to petition," the social worker explained gently. "There will be a hearing." That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She paced her room, looking at the photos on her walls, her new life documented in careful frames. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Then a gentle knock. "I made tea," Mrs. Bennet said, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Want to sit on the porch swing?" The night air was cool, and the porch light cast a gentle glow around them. Moths danced in the light as they swayed slowly on the swing. "I'm not going anywhere," Mrs. Bennet said finally, breaking the silence. "No matter what happens at that hearing, you will always have a home here." Maya wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I saw her face at the grocery store," she said quietly. "When that little boy asked who I was, she couldn't even say I was her daughter. And now she wants to be my mother again." "What do you want?" Mrs. Bennet asked. "Not what you think you should want, or what anyone else wants. What does your heart tell you?" Maya closed her eyes, feeling the gentle motion of the swing, smelling the night-blooming jasmine Mrs. Bennet had planted last spring. "I want to stay here," she said firmly. "I want to finish growing up in this house, with these walls that know my voice, with you who sees me, really sees me. I want Sunday dinners and garden mornings and hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. I want my mom to understand that she can't break me twice." The next day, David came over after school. He didn't say much, just sat with Maya as she sorted through old photos, not the artistic ones she took now, but faded snapshots from her early childhood. Her mother's face smiled up at them, younger and brighter, holding a tiny Maya on her hip. "You know," David said, studying one of the photos, "sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on. Sometimes it's letting go." Maya picked up her camera, her constant companion now, and took a picture of the scattered old photos on her bedroom floor. Then she carefully gathered them up and placed them in an envelope. At the post office, Mrs. Bennet stood beside her as Maya addressed the envelope to her mother's new address. The social worker had provided it for the legal proceedings. "Dear Mother," The note inside read, "I hope you find the happiness you're looking for with your new family. I found mine. Please let me keep it. Maya." She dropped the envelope in the mailbox and felt something settle in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Behind her, Mrs. Bennet waited patiently, keys in hand, ready to drive them home to their house with its crooked mailbox and blooming garden, where David was coming over for dinner, where her camera waited on her desk, where her future felt as solid as the ground beneath her feet. Spring arrived with a burst of color in Mrs. Bennet's garden. Maya stood at her bedroom window, watching the first morning light touch the daffodils they'd planted together last fall. Her camera sat ready on her desk, but for once, she wasn't reaching for it. Instead, she was holding a letter. The envelope had her mother's name in the corner, and Maya's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single page and a familiar photo, the one from the grocery store day, of Maya's flower-covered hands next to Mrs. Bennet's. "Dear Maya," the letter began, "thank you for sending me the old photos. You were right. I need to let you go. Seeing how you've grown, the life you've built, I'm proud of you, even though I don't have the right to be. I've withdrawn my petition for reunification. Be happy, my brave girl." Maya sat on her bed, letting the morning sun warm her face as tears rolled down her cheeks. They weren't sad tears, exactly. They felt more like rain after a long drought. Necessary, cleansing. A soft knock at her door made her look up. Mrs. Bennet stood there, concern written on her face. "Honey." The adoption lawyer called. "Your mother." Withdrew her petition. Maya finished, holding up the letter. "I know." Mrs. Bennet crossed the room and sat beside her. "How do you feel?" Maya thought about it, really thought about it. "Like I can breathe again," she said finally. Like I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore." That afternoon, Maya had her final college interview, a scholarship opportunity that seemed impossible just months ago. The interviewer, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Chen, looked through Maya's portfolio with careful attention. "Your photography is remarkable," she said, pausing at the flower hands photo. "But what really strikes me is the story behind it. Tell me about your journey." For the first time, Maya found herself telling her whole story without hesitation or shame. She talked about the empty duffel bag that had been her constant companion, about Mrs. Bennet's patient love, about learning to see beauty through a camera lens. She talked about David's friendship, about garden mornings and Sunday dinners, about choosing your family and letting yourself be chosen back. "I used to think being strong meant not needing anyone," Maya concluded. "Now I know it means being brave enough to let people in." Dr. Chen set down the portfolio and smiled. "Ms. Johnson, I think you'll find our art program's focus on personal narrative very fitting. Welcome to the class of 2025. Maya practically floated home, her acceptance letter clutched tight in her hand. She found Mrs. Bennet in the garden, as usual, this time planting spring vegetables. David was there too, helping with the heavy digging, his mother watching from a garden chair as she continued her recovery. "I got in," Maya announced, waving the letter. "Full scholarship." The next moments were a blur of hugs and tears and laughter. Mrs. Bennet insisted on making Maya's favorite celebration dinner, her famous lasagna with garlic bread. As they all gathered around the kitchen table, Mrs. Bennet, David and his family, even Ms. Rodriguez who'd stopped by to hear the news, Maya reached for her camera. Click. The way the evening light caught the happy tears in Mrs. Bennet's eyes. Click. David's mother's proud smile as she helped set the table, stronger every day. Click. The family they'd all built together, piece by piece, choice by choice. Later, as the stars came out, Maya and Mrs. Bennet sat on the porch swing, sharing the last piece of celebration cake. "You know what I realized today?" Maya said softly. "When I was telling my story to Dr. Chen, every single photo in my portfolio was taken in this house, in this garden, with these people. Everything that matters to me now. It all started here." Mrs. Bennet squeezed her hand. "And just think, This is only the beginning of your story. The morning of graduation dawned bright and clear. Maya stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her cap and gown, while Mrs. Bennett, now officially Mom, fussed with the honor cords draped around her shoulders. The past few months had been a whirlwind of college preparations, final exams, and last-minute photography projects. "Hold still," Mom said, pinning a small camera charm to Maya's gown. "This was supposed to be for your birthday next month, but it felt right for today." Maya touched the tiny silver charm, fighting back tears. "It's perfect," she whispered, remembering that old borrowed camera from Ms. Rodriguez's classroom that had changed everything. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in. David waved from his spot in the graduation line, his valedictorian medals glinting under the lights. His mother, now in remission, sat in the front row with his sisters, all of them beaming with pride. When the principal called Maya to the podium for her speech, she'd been chosen to introduce the valedictorian. She felt her hands shake. But then she saw her family in the audience. Mom with her garden-worn hands clasped tight, Ms. Rodriguez dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, David's family holding up a handmade sign covered in glitter. 2 years ago, Maya began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I walked into this school carrying everything I owned in one bag. I'd learned to pack light, to keep my heart even lighter. I thought that was what it meant to be strong." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "But real strength, I discovered, isn't about what you can carry alone. It's about learning to set that burden down, about letting others help you build something permanent. Sometimes strength looks like a borrowed camera, teaching you to see beauty in ordinary moments. Sometimes it looks like a Sunday dinner invitation that turns into a weekly tradition. Sometimes it looks like a friend who stays late to help you study, or a teacher who sees the artist in you before you see it yourself." Maya gestured to David. "Our valedictorian taught me that lesson too. When his family faced their darkest hours, he showed me that true courage isn't about facing challenges alone. It's about letting people stand beside you in the storm." Her voice softened. "And sometimes strength looks like a woman who plants marigolds by her front steps, who offers hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, who teaches you that love isn't about DNA or documents. It's about choosing each other every single day." After the ceremony, amid the chaos of flying caps and flashing cameras, Maya found herself surrounded by her chosen family. David's youngest sister crowned her with a flower crown she'd made herself. Ms. Rodriguez presented her with a brand new professional camera, a graduation gift from the entire art department. "For college," she said with a wink. "Though I expect you to come back and teach my students someday." Later that evening, they all gathered in the backyard. Mom had strung lights through the garden, and the early summer air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. Maya set up her tripod, determined to capture this moment properly. "Everyone squeeze in," she called, setting the timer. She rushed to take her place between Mom and David, feeling the warm press of family all around her. Click. The photo would show them all laughing, slightly blurred with movement. Mom with her arm around Maya, David's family intertwined with theirs, Ms. Rodriguez raising a toast in the background. It wasn't a perfect photo by technical standards, but it was perfect in all the ways that mattered. As the stars came out, Maya sat on the porch steps, watching her family share cake and stories. Her college acceptance letter was pinned to the fridge, her new camera sat ready for tomorrow's adventures, and her old duffel bag had long since been relegated to the attic, no longer needed for quick escapes. "Penny for your thoughts?" Mom asked, settling beside her with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Maya smiled, accepting her mug. "Extra marshmallows, just like always." "I was just thinking. I spent so many years looking for home. Who knew it would end up finding me instead?" Above them, the first star of evening appeared, bright and steady as a promise kept. Maya didn't need to photograph this moment. Some memories, she'd learned, were best held in the heart.